I knew something was wrong the moment I pulled my delivery truck into the commercial plaza off Highway 287 in Fort Worth, Texas, and saw three brand new sedans parked in my loading dock area. The bright yellow lines that clearly marked the zone as a no parking loading area were being completely ignored, and sitting on the hood of one of those cars was a woman with short bleached blonde hair and oversized sunglasses, examining her manicured nails like she owned the entire world. My name is Xavier Hughes, and I run a family-owned logistics company that specializes in restaurant supply distribution throughout the Dallas-Fort Worth metroplex. My warehouse sits in a commercial plaza that shares property with a residential community called Magnolia Heights, one of those mixed-use developments that developers love to build, because they can squeeze both residential and commercial properties onto the same plot of land. When I bought my warehouse space 5 years ago, everything was clearly delineated. My loading dock area was mine, the residential parking was theirs, and there was never any confusion about boundaries. That changed 3 months ago when the Magnolia Heights Homeowners Association elected a new president named Brenda Calloway. Brenda was one of those women who treated HOA leadership like she was running a military dictatorship. And from what I heard through the grapevine, she had already driven half the neighborhood crazy with new rules about lawn ornaments, acceptable paint colors, and mandatory participation in community beautification projects. I parked my truck on the street and walked over to the loading dock. The woman on the car hood looked up as I approached, and I could see the entitled smirk forming on her face before I even said a word. "Can I help you?" I asked, keeping my tone professional despite the irritation bubbling up inside me. "This is residential parking," she said, not bothering to move. "We're residents of Magnolia Heights." I pointed to the yellow lines, then to the massive sign on the wall that read, "Loading dock, no parking, violators will be towed." "This is private commercial property," I said. "My property. You're blocking my loading dock where I need to park delivery trucks." She finally stood up, crossing her arms. "The HOA board voted last week. This area is now overflow parking for residents. We have a parking shortage." I felt my jaw tighten. "You can't just vote to take someone else's property." "We have jurisdiction over all common areas in the development," she said, pulling out her phone. "I can show you the new community guidelines if you want. This isn't a common area. I own this warehouse and this loading dock. I have a deed." She shrugged. "Take it up with Brenda Calloway. She's the HOA president. I'm just following the new rules." I pulled out my own phone and took pictures of the cars, their license plates, and the woman herself. She noticed and rolled her eyes. "You can take all the pictures you want. We're not moving." I called the non-emergency police line right there. If they wanted to play games, I could play too. An officer arrived about 40 minutes later, a tired-looking cop named Officer Martinez, who looked like he had dealt with one too many HOA disputes in his career. After I explained the situation and showed him my property documents on my phone, he approached the woman and the two other residents who had emerged from their cars. "Madam, this is private commercial property," Officer Martinez said. "You need to move your vehicles." "The HOA has authority over parking in this development," the woman insisted. "Not over private commercial property, they don't," Martinez said, his patience clearly wearing thin. "Move the cars now, or I'll have them towed and you'll get citations for trespassing." They moved, but not without the woman making a big show of calling someone on her phone and saying loudly, "Brenda, you need to get down here. Some warehouse owner is harassing residents." I thanked Officer Martinez and got to work. I had 3 deliveries scheduled that afternoon, and I was already behind schedule. But I knew this wasn't over. People like that don't just give up because a cop tells them they're wrong. Sure enough, 2 days later, I arrived at 6 in the morning to find a construction crew erecting bollards right through the middle of my loading dock area. Not on the edges, not in the residential parking, but right through my clearly marked commercial space. A woman in a navy blue pantsuit was standing nearby, holding a clipboard and directing the workers. I parked and jumped out. "What the hell is going on?" She turned to me with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. She was in her late 40s, with dark brown hair pulled into a tight bun, and the kind of expression that suggested she was used to people doing exactly what she said. "You must be Mr. Hughes. I'm Brenda Calloway, president of the Magnolia Heights HOA. Why are you putting bollards in my loading dock?" "We're creating designated parking spaces for residents," she said calmly. "The development has experienced significant growth and we need additional parking. This is my property, private commercial property." She consulted her clipboard. According to the original development agreement from 2015, all parking areas within the Magnolia Heights development are considered common areas subject to HOA oversight. My loading dock isn't a parking area. It's a loading dock for commercial vehicles on commercial property. "The development agreement doesn't make that distinction," Brenda said. "We sent you a courtesy notice last week about the changes." "I didn't receive any notice. We sent it to the mailing address on file." She smiled again. "Regardless, the work is proceeding. We have the authority to manage common areas as we see fit." I pulled out my phone and called my attorney, a sharp woman named Patricia Drummond, who had handled my business contracts for years. While it rang, I watched the construction crew pour concrete for the bollard bases right through the middle of my loading zone. Patricia answered on the third ring, and I explained the situation. "Don't let them finish," she said immediately. "I'm calling for an emergency injunction. In the meantime, document everything." I took video of the entire scene, making sure to capture Brenda's face, the workers, and the exact location of where they were installing the bollards. When I told Brenda that my attorney was seeking an injunction, she simply shrugged. "Your attorney can contact our HOA legal team. We're confident in our position." The bollards went up, 6 of them, creating 3 parking spaces right where my trucks needed to access the loading dock. By the end of that day, those spaces were full of residents' cars, and I had to unload 3 delivery trucks on the street, blocking traffic and risking citations. Patricia filed the emergency injunction that afternoon, but the court date wasn't for 2 weeks. In the meantime, I was screwed. I had deliveries every single day, and my loading dock was now unusable. I tried to adapt, tried to work around it, but the logistics were a nightmare. My drivers were frustrated, my customers were getting delayed deliveries, and I was hemorrhaging money in overtime costs and efficiency losses. On day 4, I got a citation from the city for blocking the street during an unloading. The fine was $300. I called the city and explained the situation, but they said I needed to resolve the property dispute first. They couldn't just let me block the street. That night, I sat in my warehouse office, staring at the mess of papers on my desk. Invoices, schedules, complaints from customers, and now a citation. My business was my life. I had built it from nothing after leaving my job as a logistics manager for a big corporate outfit. I had worked 16-hour days, missed birthdays and holidays, and sacrificed everything to make this company work. And now some power-hungry HOA president was destroying it because she wanted 3 extra parking spaces. My delivery supervisor, a guy named Marcus Webb who had been with me since the beginning, knocked on my office door. "Boss, we got a problem." That same woman from the other day, the blonde one, she's parking in the loading dock again. Says she's going to park there every day now because it's closer to her condo. I rubbed my face. Of course she is. Want me to call a tow truck? They won't tow from an HOA-controlled area without HOA authorization. Brenda made sure of that. She called all the local towing companies and told them this is HOA parking now. Marcus sat down across from me. So what are we going to do? I looked at him, then at the window that overlooked the loading dock, where I could see the blonde woman's car sitting smugly in my loading zone. An idea was forming, one that was probably stupid, definitely petty, but might actually work. How many trucks do we have in the fleet right now? I asked. 12. 10 box trucks and 2 semis. And where are they parked overnight? The semis are at the lot off Route 820. The box trucks are scattered, some here, some at drivers' homes. I stood up and walked to the window. The residential area of Magnolia Heights was behind my warehouse, and there was only one road in and out of the neighborhood. A single 2-lane street that ran past my warehouse and connected to the main highway. It was the only access point for the entire community of about 200 homes. Bring all the trucks here, I said. Park them on the street along the entire frontage of my property. Marcus followed my gaze and understanding dawned on his face. Boss, that's going to block the entrance to their neighborhood. No, it won't. It'll be parked on a public street legally in front of my business. If there happens to be only one narrow lane left for traffic to squeeze through, well, that's just an unfortunate coincidence. They're going to lose their minds. Probably. But you know what? I'm losing my business. They took my loading dock. They made it impossible for me to operate. So if my trucks need to park on the public street because I don't have access to my loading dock anymore, that's what's going to happen. Marcus grinned. I'll make the calls. By midnight, all 12 of my trucks were lined up along the street in front of my warehouse. They were legally parked, with proper clearance from fire hydrants and driveways, but they created a wall of vehicles that narrowed the entrance to Magnolia Heights to barely 1 lane. Cars could still get in and out, but it was tight, slow, and incredibly annoying. The next morning, I was in my office by 5, waiting for the fireworks. They started at 7:15 when the morning commute began. I watched from my window as residents tried to navigate the narrow passage, honking horns and shouting. Some got out of their cars to look at my trucks, trying to find a reason to call the police or a tow company. By 8, Brenda Calloway was at my door, her face red with fury. You need to move those trucks immediately, she demanded. I was sitting at my desk, sipping coffee. They're legally parked on a public street. You're blocking access to our neighborhood. No, I'm not. There's still a full lane available. Traffic is moving, maybe slowly, but it's moving. This is deliberate harassment. I set down my coffee and looked at her directly. You seized my loading dock. You made it impossible for me to run my business. My trucks have to park somewhere. The street is public property. If you want me to park them in my loading dock instead, feel free to remove those bollards. Her eyes narrowed. I will call the police. Go ahead. She did. Officer Martinez showed up again, along with another officer named Diaz. They examined the trucks, measured distances, and checked for violations. I had made sure everything was by the book. The trucks are legally parked, Officer Martinez told Brenda. There's nothing we can do. He's doing this deliberately to block our neighborhood. He's parking his commercial vehicles on a public street in a legal manner, Officer Diaz said. We can't tell him where to park his vehicles as long as he's following the law. Brenda's hands were shaking with anger. This is harassment. I'll call the city. I'll call the mayor's office. You're welcome to do that, Martinez said, sounding exhausted. But unless he's breaking a law, there's nothing anyone can do. After the police left, Brenda turned to me one more time. "You're making a big mistake, Mr. Hughes." "No," I said quietly. "You made the mistake when you took my loading dock. The truck stayed there all day. My drivers used them for deliveries, taking them out and bringing them back throughout the day, but someone was always parked in that line, maintaining the blockade. Residents had to navigate the tight squeeze every time they wanted to enter or exit their neighborhood. I saw cars scraping past with inches to spare, drivers making three-point turns to adjust their angle, and more than a few people giving my warehouse the finger as they passed. I didn't care. For the first time in days, I felt like I had some control over the situation. Patricia called that afternoon with news about the injunction hearing. "I've been reviewing the development agreement they're citing," she said. "It's a mess. The language is vague, probably intentionally so. But I found something interesting. The commercial properties were sold separately from the residential, and your deed explicitly includes the loading dock area with its specific dimensions and purpose. That should supersede any general development agreement. So we have a good case. I think so. But judges don't like property disputes, especially involving HOAs. They tend to encourage mediation. Are you willing to negotiate? Depends on the negotiation. If it's give them my loading dock, then no. If it's they remove their bollards and stay off my property, then yes. I'll make that clear at the hearing." That night, things escalated. Around 11, I got a call from one of my drivers, a guy named Thomas Lee who lived near the warehouse and often stopped by to check on the trucks. "Boss, someone slashed the tires on 3 of the trucks," he said. I was there in 10 minutes. Sure enough, 3 of the box trucks had multiple tires slashed. The damage looked deliberate, clean cuts that would require full replacements. I called the police again, and this time a different officer arrived, a woman named Officer Jennings who actually seemed interested in investigating. "Any cameras?" she asked. I pointed to the security camera mounted on my warehouse. "That one covers this area." We reviewed the footage in my office. At 10:30, a figure in dark clothing and a hood had approached the trucks with what looked like a knife and systematically slashed tires on 3 vehicles. The person was clearly trying to hide their identity, but in one frame when they passed under a streetlight, I could make out blonde hair under the hood. "I know who that is," I said, pointing to the screen. "That's a resident named." I realized I didn't actually know her name. "She's one of the people who's been parking in my loading dock. Blonde hair, drives a silver Nissan." Officer Jennings took a statement and copies of the video footage. "We'll investigate. This is criminal mischief, possibly vandalism. If we can identify her, she'll be charged." "Can you check with the HOA? They should have resident information." "We'll do that." The tire damage cost me $4,000 in replacements and another 2 days of delayed deliveries while 3 of my trucks were out of commission. But I didn't move the remaining trucks. If anything, I got more creative. I started parking them even more strategically, making the squeeze into Magnolia Heights even tighter. By the end of the first week, the Magnolia Heights Facebook group was in full meltdown mode. I knew because my warehouse worker, a college kid named Derek, lived in the neighborhood with his parents and showed me some of the posts. People were furious. Some were angry at me, calling me petty and vindictive. But surprisingly, many were angry at Brenda and the HOA board. They were asking why the HOA had picked a fight with a commercial property owner in the first place. Why they needed 3 parking spaces badly enough to create this nightmare. Several people posted photos of empty parking spaces elsewhere in the neighborhood, questioning the entire justification for seizing my loading dock. One resident, a guy who identified himself as a real estate attorney, pointed out that the HOA's interpretation of the development agreement was legally questionable, and that they might have just created massive liability for the entire association. Brenda responded to the criticisms with her typical iron-fisted approach, saying the board knew what was best for the community, and that residents needed to trust their leadership. That went over about as well as expected. By day 9, a petition was circulating to call for an emergency HOA meeting to review the parking situation. It needed 20% of homeowners to sign, and it got there in less than 48 hours. Meanwhile, the police identified the tire slasher. Her name was Jennifer Kowalski, the blonde woman who had been parking in my loading dock. She was arrested and charged with criminal mischief. Her bail was set at $5,000, and suddenly she wasn't quite so smug anymore. I pressed charges and filed a civil suit for damages. My insurance covered the tire replacement, but I wanted to make a point. You don't get to vandalize someone's property just because you're entitled enough to think you deserve their parking space. The emergency HOA meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday evening. Patricia advised me to attend. "This is your chance to address the residents directly," she said. "Most of them probably have no idea what actually happened. They just know that trucks are blocking their street and they're mad about it." I didn't particularly want to face an angry mob of homeowners, but I saw her point. If I could turn residents against Brenda's position, the HOA might be forced to back down even before our court date. The meeting was held in the community clubhouse, a fancy building with a pool, gym, and event space. When I arrived, the parking lot was packed, and I could hear raised voices even from outside. I walked in to find at least 100 people crammed into a room designed for half that many. Brenda was at the front table with 4 other board members, all looking varying degrees of uncomfortable, except for Brenda herself, who maintained her composed, authoritarian expression. The meeting started with standard HOA business, financial reports, and maintenance updates, but everyone was clearly impatient to get to the main event. Finally, Brenda addressed the elephant in the room. "I know many of you have concerns about the parking situation," she said. The board made a decision to expand resident parking by incorporating an underutilized loading area into our parking inventory. Unfortunately, the business owner has responded with what we consider retaliatory behavior, parking his commercial vehicles in a manner designed to inconvenience our community. A man in the back shouted, "You mean you took his property?" And he responded by parking legally on a public street. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Brenda's jaw tightened. The development agreement gives the HOA authority over common areas, including parking areas. "His loading dock isn't a common area," someone else called out. "It's part of his commercial property." "That's a matter of legal interpretation," Brenda said. "Our attorneys have reviewed the situation." "Then why are people online saying we're going to lose a lawsuit and the HOA will have to pay damages?" a woman asked. "Social media is not a reliable source of legal information," Brenda replied coldly. I decided it was time to speak up. I raised my hand, and after a moment, Brenda reluctantly acknowledged me. "Mr. Hughes, would you like to address the board?" I stood up, and 100 pairs of eyes turned to me. I felt surprisingly calm. "My name is Xavier Hughes. I own Hughes Logistics, the warehouse on the edge of your community. I bought that property 5 years ago. When I bought it, it came with a clearly defined loading dock area for my commercial trucks. That loading dock is essential to my business. I make deliveries to restaurants all over the Metroplex, and I need a place to load and unload vehicles safely and efficiently." I pulled out my phone and brought up a photo I had taken before the bollards went up. 3 weeks ago, residents started parking in my loading dock. When I asked them to move, they said the HOA had given them permission. Then, without any notice to me, the HOA installed bollards through the middle of my loading dock, making it completely unusable. When I objected, I was told the HOA has authority over all parking areas. I looked directly at Brenda. The problem is, my loading dock isn't an HOA parking area. It's private commercial property. I have a deed. I pay property taxes on it, and you don't have the right to take it just because you decided you need more parking. The development agreement, Brenda started. I've had attorneys review the development agreement, I interrupted. The commercial properties were sold separately with specific deeds that supersede general common area provisions. You took my property without legal authority, and you made it impossible for me to run my business. A woman near the front asked, "So why are you blocking our street?" "I'm not blocking your street. I'm parking my trucks legally on a public street because I can't park them in my loading dock anymore. If I could use my loading dock, my trucks would be there, not on the street. But since the HOA took my loading dock, the street is the only option I have." The room erupted in conversation. People were arguing with each other, with Brenda, with the other board members. I heard several people saying things like, "This is ridiculous, and we should never have gotten involved in this." One of the other board members, an older man who had been looking increasingly uncomfortable, spoke up. "Brenda, maybe we should consider removing the bollards until the legal situation is resolved." "Absolutely not," Brenda snapped. "We have authority over this area. We're not backing down because one business owner is throwing a tantrum." "A tantrum," I said, my voice rising. "You destroyed my business operations. You cost me thousands of dollars in lost efficiency and citations. One of your residents slashed my truck tires, and you're calling this a tantrum." "The vandalism was the action of one individual," Brenda said. "The HOA is not responsible for that." "No, but you created the environment that led to it. You told residents they had a right to my property. You made them think I was the bad guy for defending what's mine." Another board member, a younger woman, spoke up. "Brenda, I didn't realize when we voted on this that we were taking commercial property. I thought we were just reorganizing existing HOA parking." "The development agreement is clear," Brenda insisted. "No, it's not," I said. "That's why we're going to court. And when the judge rules that you illegally seized my property, this HOA is going to be liable for damages. Every homeowner here is going to see their HOA fees go up to pay for Brenda's mistake." That got their attention. Nothing motivates HOA members quite like the threat of increased fees. The room erupted again, this time with more people openly criticizing the board's decision. The real estate attorney I had seen posting on Facebook stood up. "I've reviewed the publicly available documents on this. The original commercial deeds are very specific about property boundaries and intended use. Loading docks are explicitly mentioned. I don't think the HOA has a strong legal position here." "That's your opinion," Brenda said tersely. "It's a professional opinion based on 20 years of real estate law," the man shot back. "And if I was on this board, I'd be looking for a way to resolve this before it gets to court, because I think we're going to lose." The meeting devolved into chaos. People were shouting, the board members were arguing among themselves, and Brenda was trying to maintain control but failing. Eventually, she called for a vote to remove the bollards pending legal resolution. 2 board members voted yes, 2 voted no, and Brenda voted no as the tie-breaker. The motion failed. The bollards stayed, but something had shifted. The community was no longer unified behind the HOA's position. People were questioning Brenda's leadership, and I could see the other board members starting to distance themselves from her. I left the meeting and went back to my warehouse. My truck stayed on the street. Over the next week, the pressure on Brenda intensified. More residents started complaining publicly about the inconvenience. A local news crew caught wind of the story and did a segment on HOA overreach, featuring interviews with me and several frustrated residents. Brenda refused to be interviewed, which made the HOA look even worse. My court date arrived on a cold Thursday morning in late March. Patricia and I arrived at the Tarrant County Courthouse downtown, and I was surprised to see a different attorney representing the HOA. Not their regular counsel, but a more expensive-looking lawyer from a big firm in Dallas. "They're taking this seriously," Patricia whispered to me. The hearing was in front of Judge Margaret Hollies, a no-nonsense woman in her 60s who had a reputation for cutting through the garbage and getting to the heart of property disputes. Both sides presented their arguments. The HOA's attorney argued that the development agreement gave the association broad authority over parking areas throughout the development, and that my loading dock fell under that umbrella. Patricia countered with my specific deed, the original commercial property disclosures, and evidence that the loading dock had always been treated as private commercial property for tax and regulatory purposes. Judge Hollies asked pointed questions of both attorneys, and I could tell she was not impressed with the HOA's position. When the HOA attorney tried to claim that loading dock was just another term for parking area, the judge actually laughed. "Counselor, I may be old, but I'm not stupid. A loading dock is a commercial facility for loading and unloading cargo. It's not a parking lot for residents' personal vehicles." After 2 hours of arguments, Judge Hollies announced her decision. "I'm granting the injunction. The Magnolia Heights HOA is ordered to immediately remove all bollards and parking designations from the plaintiff's loading dock area. The deed clearly establishes this as private commercial property with a specific commercial purpose. The development agreement's common area provisions do not override individual property deeds. Furthermore, I'm ordering the HOA to pay Mr. Hughes's legal fees and damages for lost business during the period his loading dock was unusable." I felt a wave of relief wash over me. Patricia squeezed my arm, grinning. "The HOA is prohibited from interfering with Mr. Hughes's use of his property," the judge continued. "Any resident who parks in the loading dock can be towed at the HOA's expense, and if this matter comes before me again, I will not be pleased." The HOA attorney looked like he wanted to crawl under the table. We filed out of the courthouse, and Patricia immediately got on the phone with the HOA's legal team to arrange for the bollard removal. "They'll have them out by tomorrow," she told me. "And they're going to pay you $25,000 in damages plus legal fees. The judge is drafting a formal order." I drove back to Fort Worth feeling lighter than I had in weeks. When I got to the warehouse, I found Marcus and told him the news. "So we can move the trucks?" he asked. "Give it until tomorrow when the bollards are out. Then yeah, we can move them." That evening, I got a call from one of the board members who had voted to remove the bollards at the HOA meeting. Her name was Susan Patterson, and she sounded exhausted. "Mr. Hughes, I want to apologize on behalf of the board. This should never have happened. Brenda pushed this through without proper due diligence, and we should have pushed back harder." "I appreciate that," I said. "I also want you to know that we're calling for an emergency board election. Several of us are resigning, and we're asking the community to elect new leadership. Brenda has refused to resign, but I think the members are going to vote her out. Good luck with that. Thank you. And again, I'm sorry for what you went through." The next day, A construction crew showed up and removed the bollards. I stood watching as they jackhammered the concrete bases and filled in the holes. By noon, my loading dock was clear again. I moved all 12 trucks into my property, opening up the street and ending the blockade of Magnolia Heights. The relief from residents was immediate. The Facebook group filled with posts celebrating the end of the truck wall, though there was still plenty of anger directed at Brenda and the board. Over the next 2 weeks, I learned through Derek that the Magnolia Heights HOA was imploding. Susan Patterson and another board member resigned. A special election was called, and Brenda lost her position as president by a landslide. The new board president was the real estate attorney who had spoken up at the meeting, and one of his first acts was to issue a formal written apology to me and assurance that the HOA would never interfere with my property again. Jennifer Kowalski, the tire slasher, pled guilty to criminal mischief in exchange for probation and restitution. She had to pay me back for the tires plus damages, and she ended up moving out of Magnolia Heights a month later. Apparently the shame of being that woman who slashed the tires was too much for her to handle, but the story didn't end there. About 6 weeks after the judge's ruling, I got a call from a law firm I didn't recognize. An attorney named Robert Finch introduced himself and explained that he represented a group of Magnolia Heights residents who were filing a lawsuit against Brenda Calloway personally. "We believe Miss Calloway exceeded her authority and acted in bad faith," Finch explained. "She cost the HOA significant money in legal fees and damages. She created liability for the association, and she did so despite being warned by multiple people that her position was legally questionable. Several homeowners want to hold her personally responsible. Can they do that?" I asked. "Possibly. If we can prove she acted outside the scope of her authority and with knowledge that she was in the wrong, board members can be held personally liable. It's a high bar, but we think we have a case. You need anything from me. We may call you as a witness if it goes to trial. Would you be willing to testify about your interactions with Miss Calloway?" I thought about Brenda's smug face when she told me the bollards were going up. Her refusal to even consider that she might be wrong. The way she dismissed the concerns of her own board members and residents. "Yeah," I said, "I'll testify. That lawsuit took months to wind through the legal system. I gave a deposition in July describing everything that had happened." The attorneys had emails and documents showing that Brenda had been warned by the HOA's own attorney that seizing my loading dock was risky and legally questionable, but she had pushed forward anyway. They had testimony from other board members that Brenda had misrepresented the legal advice they received and rushed the vote through before anyone could do proper research. The case settled out of court in October. Brenda agreed to pay $50,000 to the HOA to reimburse legal fees and damages. She also agreed to never seek HOA board membership in any community again. It wasn't everything the residents wanted, but it was something. By that point, my business was back to normal. My loading dock was functioning perfectly. My trucks were parked where they belonged. My deliveries were on time, and my customers were happy. The whole nightmare felt like a distant memory, but I learned some valuable lessons. I learned that HOAs can be dangerous when led by the wrong people. I learned that standing up for your rights sometimes requires being willing to be the bad guy in the short term. And I learned that property deeds matter a lot. And you should never assume that boundaries are clear just because they seem obvious. I also learned that communities are more reasonable than their worst leaders. Once the residents of Magnolia Heights understood what was really happening, most of them sided with me or at least recognized that the HOA had made a mistake. It was Brenda's ego and stubbornness that had driven the conflict, not any real community need. The new HOA board reached out to me in November with a proposal. They wanted to create a good neighbor agreement, a formal document that would clearly define the boundaries between commercial and residential areas, establish communication protocols for any future concerns, and generally ensure that what happened with Brenda could never happen again. I agreed. Patricia reviewed the agreement, and we signed it in December at a small ceremony at the community clubhouse. The new board president gave a speech about learning from past mistakes and building better relationships between the commercial and residential parts of the development. It was all very nice and diplomatic, but I kept my guard up. I had learned that even the friendliest HOA is just one election away from disaster. In January, I got a letter from the Texas Attorney General's office. Apparently, the news coverage of my situation had prompted them to open a broader investigation into HOA overreach and abuse of authority across the state. They wanted to interview me about my experiences. I spent 2 hours on the phone with an investigator, describing everything that had happened. She told me that my case was one of dozens they were looking at, part of a pattern of HOAs exceeding their authority and creating hardship for property owners. "You think anything will change?" I asked. "Hard to say, but your story is compelling. The fact that you won in court, that residents turned against their own board, and that there were criminal charges involved, it makes for a strong case study in what can go wrong with HOA governance." A few months later, a state representative introduced legislation to reform HOA laws in Texas, including clearer definitions of HOA authority, stronger protections for commercial property owners, and penalties for board members who exceed their authority. The bill cited my case specifically in its supporting documentation. I was invited to testify before a state legislative committee in March. I took a day off from work and drove to Austin, where I told my story to a room full of politicians and their staff. Some of them seemed genuinely interested. Others were clearly just going through the motions, but I felt like I was doing something important. The bill passed in a modified form that May. It wasn't everything reformers wanted, but it included provisions that required HOAs to get independent legal opinions before taking action against commercial properties, and it created a clearer process for property owners to challenge HOA overreach. It also made board members potentially personally liable if they ignored legal advice and caused damages to the association. If that law had been in place when Brenda seized my loading dock, things might have played out very differently. By the time the first anniversary of the Ballard incident rolled around, life had settled into a comfortable rhythm. My business was thriving. I had expanded my fleet to 15 trucks, and I had actually started getting new customers specifically because they had heard about how I stood up to the HOA. Apparently, guy who blocked an entire neighborhood with trucks was good for business in certain circles. Derek, my warehouse worker, graduated from college and took a full-time position with me as a logistics coordinator. Marcus got promoted to operations manager. I hired 3 new drivers and leased a second warehouse space on the other side of Fort Worth. Magnolia Heights got a new board president, a retired engineer named Michael Torres, who ran the HOA like a competent administrator rather than a dictator. He reached out to me occasionally with minor concerns, always respectfully and always with the acknowledgement that my property was my property. We developed a good working relationship. I never saw Brenda Calloway again. I heard through the grapevine that she moved to a different neighborhood, somewhere in North Dallas. I hoped for the sake of that community that she had learned something from her experience, but I wasn't optimistic. Jennifer Kowalski finished her probation and apparently moved to Oklahoma. She never apologized to me directly, but she did pay the restitution in full, which was something. Looking back on the whole thing, I'm still amazed at how quickly things spiraled out of control. One person with too much authority and not enough common sense nearly destroyed my business. If I hadn't been willing to fight back, if I hadn't had the resources to hire a good attorney and weather the storm, I might have lost everything. But I did fight back, in the most petty and effective way I could think of. I didn't vandalize their property or break any laws. I just parked my trucks on a public street in a way that was perfectly legal but incredibly inconvenient. I used the same kind of technicality-based reasoning that Brenda had used to justify taking my loading dock, and I turned it against her. Was it petty? Absolutely. Was it effective? Extremely. Did it make me the bad guy in the short term? Sure, to some people. But it also forced the issue, brought the conflict to a head, and ultimately led to a resolution that restored my property rights and reformed a dysfunctional HOA board. Sometimes being petty is the right strategic move. Sometimes you have to be willing to inconvenience people to protect what's yours. And sometimes the only way to fight unreasonable authority is with creative resistance. I still drive past Magnolia Heights every day on my way to work. The entrance is clear now, no wall of trucks blocking the way. My loading dock is busy with my vehicles coming and going, doing what a loading dock is supposed to do. The bollard holes have been patched and repaved, barely visible anymore. Every time I see that loading dock, I remember what it felt like to watch Brenda's construction crew pour concrete for those bollards. I remember the frustration, the anger, the feeling of helplessness as someone destroyed my business operations, and there was nothing I could do to stop it in that moment. But I also remember what it felt like to see 12 trucks lined up on that street, creating a wall of metal and inconvenience, and knowing that I had found a way to fight back. I remember watching residents struggle to navigate the narrow passage, and knowing that every moment of their inconvenience was bringing me closer to getting my property back. I'm not proud of enjoying their frustration, but I'm not ashamed of it either. They took my property. I responded in the only effective way I could, and in the end, justice was served. My attorney Patricia still laughs about the case. She says it's her favorite property dispute she's ever handled, and she tells the story at legal conferences sometimes. The image of 12 trucks blockading an entire neighborhood because the HOA seized a loading dock has become a cautionary tale in property law circles. I got a Christmas card from Susan Patterson, the former board member who apologized to me. She thanked me again for how I handled the situation and said the community was much better off with new leadership. That was nice to receive. The damages I was awarded, $25,000 plus legal fees, covered about 2/3 of what the conflict actually cost me in lost business, overtime, inefficiency, and stress. But it was enough. More importantly, getting my property back was priceless. I framed a copy of Judge Hollis's order and hung it in my office. The deed clearly establishes this as private commercial property with a specific commercial purpose. Those words meant everything to me. They were a vindication, a validation that I was right to fight, right to resist, right to park 12 trucks on a public street and make life difficult for 200 homeowners. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I had just accepted the loss of my loading dock. If I had tried to work around it, found street parking, gotten used to the inefficiency. Would Brenda have stopped there, or would she have continued to encroach on commercial properties? Would other business owners in the development have faced similar problems? I like to think that by standing up and fighting back, I not only saved my business but also prevented future abuses. The new HOA policies, the state legislation, the increased awareness of HOA overreach, all of that came out of my conflict with Brenda Calloway. My petty truck blockade had consequences that rippled far beyond Magnolia Heights. Of course, it could have gone differently. If Judge Hollies had ruled against me, I would have been stuck with legal bills and no loading dock. If residents had been more united behind their HOA board, the pressure might not have built to the point where Brenda was voted out. If the news media hadn't picked up the story, it might have just been a local dispute that quietly resolved in an unsatisfying way. But that's not what happened. I won. Justice prevailed. And now, sitting in my office on a quiet Tuesday evening, looking out at my fully functional loading dock with 2 trucks being loaded for tomorrow morning's deliveries, I can honestly say that the whole nightmare was worth it. Not because I enjoyed the conflict. Not because I liked spending months fighting an HOA and thousands of dollars on legal fees, but because I learned that standing up for yourself matters. That property rights matter. That sometimes the little guy can win against bureaucratic authority if he's willing to be creative and persistent. Marcus knocked on my office door, pulling me out of my thoughts. "Boss, we're done loading for tonight. Anything else you need?" I shook my head. "No, go home, get some rest. Big day tomorrow." He nodded and left. I sat in the quiet office for a few more minutes, then grabbed my keys and headed out. As I walked past the loading dock, I ran my hand along the wall where one of Brenda's bollards had been. The patch job was smooth, almost invisible. I got in my truck and drove home through the Fort Worth evening, past Magnolia Heights with its single entrance now flowing freely, past the commercial plaza that had become my battleground, past all the familiar landmarks of my daily route. Life was good. Business was good. My loading dock was mine, fully and legally, with a judge's order to prove it. And somewhere out there, Brenda Calloway was probably terrorizing some other community with her authoritarian approach to HOA leadership. But that was their problem, not mine. I had fought my battle and won. The 12-truck blockade had served its purpose. Justice had been delivered, and if I ever faced a similar situation again, I knew exactly what I would do. Park every truck I owned on that public street and wait for the pressure to build until something broke, because sometimes petty is powerful. Sometimes inconvenience is the best weapon, and sometimes the only way to beat an unreasonable HOA is to be just as stubborn and creative as they are. I smiled to myself as I pulled into my driveway. It had been a hell of a year, but I wouldn't change how it turned out. My loading dock was mine. My business was secure, and I had one hell of a story to tell at parties for the rest of my life. The HOA tried to seize my loading dock for parking, so I blocked their only way out with trucks for weeks, and I would do it again in a heartbeat.